730 people died on a beach in Java in 2006, and almost none of them felt the earthquake that killed them. It was a magnitude 7.7, 45 minutes offshore, and the ones who noticed anything at all described it as a mild dizziness. Then the sea came, 15 meters of it. That coastline sits directly on top of a segment of plate boundary that has never produced a great earthquake in the entire time human beings have been able to measure earthquakes at all. And this week, after 1,600 aftershocks tore through Indonesia in 3 days, a great many people started looking at it for the first time. So what is actually sitting under the south coast of Java, and is there any real reason to believe it is about to move? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. 1,600 earthquakes. In 3 days. 1,624 earthquakes. That is the number Indonesia's geophysical agency put on the board at 11 o'clock this morning, local time, and it covers a window of less than 72 hours. Every one of those events came from the same stretch of seafloor north of the island of Flores. Every one of them is an aftershock of a single rupture that happened before dawn on Saturday morning. To give you a sense of what that number means in practice, consider how the count has been moving. On Sunday, the agency published 1,576. A few hours later, the figure was 1,598. This morning it is 1,624. The catalogue is not finished. It is still filling in, event by event, as analysts work through a backlog of seismograms that arrived faster than anyone can review them. When you see a number like that climbing in real time, you're not watching new earthquakes happen, so much as watching a human being catch up with earthquakes that already did. The magnitudes run from 1.3 at the small end to 6.2 at the large end. 23 of them came in above magnitude 5. 59 of them were strong enough that people on the ground felt the shaking and reported it. Those last two numbers are the ones worth holding on to because they are going to matter a great deal in a few minutes. Now, if you have been looking at the American Geological Survey's map of the same region, you have probably seen a completely different picture. Their catalogue for the area shows something on the order of 53 events, at magnitude 4.5 and above. 53 against 1,624. That looks like a wild disagreement between two major scientific agencies, and I want to close that door immediately, because it is not a disagreement at all. It is a difference in what each network can hear. Indonesia's National Seismic Network sits directly on top of the archipelago. It has stations within a few hundred kilometers of the rupture. It can detect and locate an earthquake of magnitude 1.5 without difficulty. The global network is spread across the entire planet, and for a remote offshore source it is doing well to reliably catch everything down to about magnitude 4.5. Both catalogues are correct. They are simply measuring different slices of the same phenomenon. Whenever you see two earthquake counts that differ by a factor of 30, the first question to ask is never who is lying. It is always who is listening from how far away. So here is what actually happened. At 5:58 in the morning local time on Saturday the 15th of August, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake ruptured beneath the Flores Sea. The epicenter sat about 68 kilometers northwest of the city of Ende, a coastal city of roughly 87,000 people on the north shore of Flores. The American survey put the rupture at a depth of about 10 kilometers. The European agency put it closer to 35. That gap is normal for an offshore event where all your recording stations are lined up on one side of the source, and it is not something anyone needs to resolve tonight. At least 53 people are dead. At least 135 are injured. Roughly 5,000 have been displaced from their homes. A tsunami came ashore with observed heights reaching about 1.6 meters, which does not sound like much until you consider what 1.6 meters of moving seawater does to a fishing village built at sea level. Landslides closed the roads inland, which meant that for the first day and a half, nobody had any idea what had happened to several of the interior districts, because nobody could physically get there. And I want to point something out about that death toll because it tells you how to read every number in this story. The first wire report said 2 people had died, then 20, then 47, then 51, now 53. That is not the media being careless. That is what the count of a remote disaster always looks like from the outside, and it climbs for the same reason the aftershock catalogue climbs. The information is arriving more slowly than the event did. Anyone telling you they know the final figure right now is telling you something they cannot know. It is worth understanding the shape of the thing as well as the size. In the first day, the aftershocks at magnitude 4.5 and above spread across a zone roughly 160 kilometers long. That is the footprint of the rupture, drawn for you in small earthquakes. When a fault breaks, it does not break at a point. It tears along a surface, and the aftershocks light up the edges of the torn area over the following hours like scorch marks around a hole. 160 kilometers is the length of the tear. If you want a mental image, that is roughly the distance from London to Birmingham, and the whole of it moved. The tsunami warning went up almost immediately and covered 22 separate areas across 4 provinces. It was formally lifted a few hours later, once the tide gauges had reported and it was clear the wave had already done what it was going to do. That is the system working the way it is supposed to work, and I want to note it now, because later in this video I am going to describe a scenario in which that same system would be almost completely useless, for reasons that have nothing to do with the technology and everything to do with human perception. There is one more detail from the aftershock map that has been circulating, and I am going to handle it carefully because it is the weakest evidence in this entire story, and it is also the piece being pushed hardest. Several people tracking the catalogue in real time have described a small cluster of activity developing west of the main rupture zone, in the gap between Flores and the events further along the archipelago. We are talking about earthquakes in the magnitude 2.9 to 3.8 range. That is genuinely what the plots show. What nobody has done is relocate those events properly, check them against a background rate, or publish anything about them. A cluster of 3s on a screen is not a finding. It is a starting point for someone to do actual work on, and until that work exists, it should carry almost no weight in anybody's thinking. So that is the noise. 1,600 earthquakes, 1 large rupture, 53 dead, a small tsunami, a 160-kilometer tear in the seafloor, and a set of numbers that are all still moving. Here is why I am not going to spend this video on any of it. Because roughly 1,000 kilometers to the west of where that quake struck, running along the southern flank of the island of Java, there is a segment of plate boundary that has never produced a great earthquake in the entire time human beings have been capable of measuring earthquakes at all. Not once. Not in the instrumental record which reaches back well over a century. It is one of the most heavily loaded convergent boundaries on the planet. It is sitting directly underneath one of the most densely populated coastlines on Earth, and in the whole time we have been watching, it has done essentially nothing. That silence is the story, and what happened off Flores on Saturday is interesting to me only insofar as it changed how many people are currently looking at it. Now, there is a version of this video that leans very hard on the idea that the Flores sequence is a warning shot, that the pressure is migrating, that something enormous is loading up right now, and the aftershocks are the tell. You will find that version out there in various forms tonight, and I want to be honest with you about it, because parts of it are built on a genuinely real observation, and parts of it are built on nothing at all. Separating those two things is basically the whole job here, so let us do it properly. There is one specific feature of this aftershock sequence that is genuinely odd, and it is not the fact that there are 1,600 of them. 1,600 aftershocks from a magnitude 7.7 in a dense monitoring network is unremarkable. That is what a magnitude 7.7 does. The odd thing is what is missing from the list. Part 2. The missing sixes. Go back to the numbers the agency published this morning and look at the top of the range. Magnitude 6.2. That is the largest aftershock this entire sequence has produced. One event. The American survey catalogued theirs at 6.1, and the small difference between the two figures is just the two agencies using slightly different magnitude calculations. So treat them as the same earthquake. One magnitude 6 out of 1,624 events. To understand why that should make you sit forward slightly, you need one piece of earthquake statistics, and it has a name. It is called Barth's Law, and it comes from a Swedish seismologist who noticed something in the 1960s by simply going through a very large number of earthquake sequences and writing down what he saw. What he found was this. Across a huge sample of main shocks, the largest aftershock tends to land about 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock itself. Not exactly, on average. It is an empirical pattern pulled out of the data, not a law of physics in the way that gravity is a law of physics. Apply it here. Main shock of 7.7 minus 1.2 gives you an expected largest aftershock of around magnitude 6.5. We got 6.2. That is a shortfall of about 3/10 of a magnitude unit against the expectation, and it gets more interesting when you look at how many magnitude 6 events a sequence like this usually produces. A 7.7 main shock would typically generate somewhere on the order of 2 to 3 earthquakes in the magnitude 6 class over the following weeks. We have one. And it happened almost immediately, about 30 minutes after the main shock, in the first burst of activity, alongside a 5.9 and a 5.6 that came in 15 and 20 minutes after the main event. Since that first half hour, in nearly 3 full days and 1,600 earthquakes, the fault has not produced a single event in the magnitude 6 range. Now, why does that specific gap matter more than any other gap in the list? This is where you need one more number, and honestly, it is the single most useful number in all of earthquake science for a general audience. Here it is. Each full step up the magnitude scale corresponds to roughly 32 times more energy released. Let that do its work for a second. Not 32% more, 32 times more, which means one magnitude 6.5 releases about as much energy as 32 magnitude 5.5s, and a magnitude 5.5 releases about as much as 32 magnitude 4.5s. Multiply those together, and you get the number that reframes this entire sequence. One magnitude 6.5 earthquake is worth roughly 1,000 magnitude 4.5 earthquakes. So when someone shows you a map with 1,600 dots on it and says, look at all that energy coming out of the ground, the honest answer is that most of those dots are, energetically speaking, almost nothing. Hundreds of 3s and 4s are the seismological equivalent of loose change. They are real, they are measurable, they scatter across the map in a way that looks genuinely alarming on a screen, and they add up to a very small fraction of what 2 or 3 magnitude 6s would have released. That is the anomaly, not silence. The opposite of silence. This sequence is extraordinarily loud, and it is loud in the wrong register. It is producing enormous quantities of small and moderate earthquakes, while conspicuously failing to produce the moderate to large ones that would actually take a meaningful bite out of the strain left over from Saturday morning. And the simplest reading of that, the one your gut will jump to, is that the energy which should have come out in the magnitude 6 band has not come out, which means it is still in the rock, right? Now let me put the brakes on, because I would be doing you a disservice if I left it there. Barth's law is an average. That is not a technicality. It is the entire point. When you take thousands of earthquake sequences and compute the difference between the main shock and the biggest aftershock, you get a distribution with a peak around 1.2, and that distribution has long tails on both sides. Individual sequences scatter enormously. There are main shocks whose largest aftershock came in half a unit below them, and main shocks whose largest aftershock came in 2 full units below. A 3/10 of a unit shortfall, measured 3 days into a sequence that is expected to run for months, is comfortably inside ordinary variance. It is also very early. Aftershock sequences routinely produce their single largest event well after the first week. There are well-documented cases where the biggest aftershock arrived a month or more after the main shock, and in a handful of famous cases the largest event in the sequence turned out to be bigger than the original earthquake, which is when we stop calling the first one a main shock and start calling it a foreshock. That reclassification only ever happens looking backwards. Nobody has ever done it in advance, and here is the part that matters most. The agency that runs the network, the agency that has the best data in the world on this specific sequence, is not saying anything is anomalous. Their public position is that the sequence is decaying normally, that the decay process will continue for roughly 1 to 2 months, and that activity should stabilize within about 2 to 3 weeks. That is the boring institutional read, and the boring institutional read is right far more often than the interesting one. So hold both of these in your head at once, because both are true. The magnitude 6 deficit is a real observation about a real data set, and the interpretation that it means strain is being stored somewhere else is exactly that, an interpretation made by people watching a catalogue in real time, and not a finding published by anyone with a seismic network behind them. Still, if you take the observation seriously for a moment, and I think you should, there are 4 different explanations for where those magnitude 6s went, and they are not equally alarming. It is worth walking all 4, because the difference between them is the difference between a curiosity and a problem. The first explanation is simply that they have not happened yet. This is by far the most likely answer. 3 days is nothing. The agency itself expects elevated activity to run for 1 to 2 months. If a magnitude 6.3 shows up next Thursday, this entire line of reasoning evaporates, and the sequence goes into the books as slightly slow and otherwise completely ordinary. The second explanation is about geometry, and it is the one seismologists would reach for first. A fault has a seismogenic width, a band of depth where the rock is cold enough to break brittly rather than flow. If Saturday's rupture broke cleanly across that entire width, all the way from the shallow end to the deep end, then it did not leave behind any large intact patch to fail later. The big aftershocks in a typical sequence come from strong spots that the main rupture jumped over or stopped short of. A very efficient rupture leaves fewer of those. Fewer strong spots means fewer large aftershocks, and a sequence dominated by small events breaking up the damaged rock around the edges. That is a perfectly benign explanation, and it is consistent with everything we can see. The third explanation is about the rock itself. This is a back arc thrust rooted into a volcanic pile, which means the fault zone is structurally messy. It cuts through material of wildly varying strength. Highly heterogeneous fault zones tend to fail in many small increments rather than a few large ones, because there is no large continuous patch of anything strong enough to store a magnitude 6 worth of strain. Seismologists track this with something called the B value, which is essentially a measure of how many small earthquakes you get for every large one. A fault with lots of small events and few big ones has a high B value, and messy volcanic terrain is exactly where you would expect to find one. The fourth explanation is the one everybody wants to talk about, and it is the least constrained of the four. It says the strain was not released, it was transferred. That the rupture on Saturday pushed on its neighbours, and the load that would have come out as a magnitude 6 on the floor as thrust is now sitting on some adjacent structure instead. Stress transfer between faults is a real, measurable, published phenomenon. It is also an effect that falls off sharply with distance, and quantifying it requires modelling work that nobody has done for this event yet. 3 benign explanations and 1 interesting one. I am going to keep coming back to that distinction, because there is a place where these 2 readings actually diverge, and it is not off floors at all. It is on the other side of the volcanic arc. Part 3. The fault that broke is not the fault that matters. Here is where most of the coverage of this event has gone wrong, and it has gone wrong in a way that is completely understandable, because it requires knowing one specific thing about the geometry of Indonesia that almost nobody has any reason to know. The earthquake on Saturday did not happen on the Java Trench. It happened on something called the Flores back arc thrust, and the word that is doing all the work in that name is back. Let me build you the picture, because once you can see it, everything else in this video falls into place. Take the Indonesian archipelago and look at it in cross-section, cutting from the Indian Ocean in the south, north through the islands, and out into the seas beyond. In the south you have the Indo-Australian Plate, a vast slab of oceanic lithosphere, grinding northward and diving down beneath the Sunda plate that Indonesia sits on. That descending contact, the interface where one plate slides under the other, is the Sunda megathrust. The trench that marks it at the seafloor, the deep trough running parallel to the coast, is what we are calling the Java Trench along the section that borders Java. That subduction is what built the islands. As the descending slab goes deeper, it heats up, water cooks out of it. That water lowers the melting point of the rock above it, magma rises, and you get a chain of volcanoes running the length of the archipelago. Every volcano you have ever heard of in Indonesia exists because of that process. Krakatoa, Merapi, Semeru, Tambora. All of them are the exhaust from one enormous machine. Now keep going north, past the volcanic arc, out the other side. Behind an arc like this, the crust gets stretched and squeezed in complicated ways by the whole system, and it develops its own faults. On the northern side of Flores there is a major one, and it is a thrust fault, meaning one block is being pushed up over another, but it dips the opposite way from the main subduction interface. It leans back toward the arc rather than away from it. That is what back arc thrust means. It is a fault that lives on the wrong side of the volcanoes, moving in the opposite sense, rooted into the same volcanic pile that the subduction built. And that volcanic exhaust system is not a museum piece. It is running right now. Semeru in East Java erupted on the 5th of August and produced 23 separate eruptions in a single week. By the 12th of August, the monitoring agency was logging 100 explosions in a day, with ash plumes rising 1,100 metres above the vent. Liwatobi Laki Laki, which sits on Flores itself, on the same island as this earthquake, has been throwing up grey ash columns between 200 and 1,200 metres nearly every day since the end of July. Both of those volcanoes are on alert level 3 out of 4. Both of them were already erupting before Saturday morning. Hold on to that timing, because it becomes important later. That is the fault that broke on Saturday. The rupture dipped at about 29 degrees. The preliminary maximum slip came out around 2.6 metres. The epicenter sat at the eastern end of the aftershock cloud, which tells you the rupture propagated westward along the fault, unzipping from east to west. So picture the map now. You have the main plate boundary running along the southern side of the islands. You have the volcanic chain in the middle, and you have the back arc thrust on the northern side. Saturday's earthquake happened on the northern structure. The thing I want to talk about tonight is on the southern one. They are separated by the entire width of the volcanic arc, and by the fact that they are, mechanically, different systems doing different jobs. Which raises the obvious question, and it is a fair one. If they are separate, why am I connecting them at all? Why does an earthquake on the backside of the arc have anything to say about the interface on the front side? 2 reasons, and I want to be precise about how strong each one is. The first reason is weak, and I am flagging it as weak. The 2 systems are not truly independent, because they are both being driven by the same convergence. The Indo-Australian plate pushing north is the ultimate cause of the strain on both structures. If you change the stress state on one part of that machine, you have in principle changed it, by some usually tiny amount, everywhere else in the machine. This is real physics. It is also, in most cases, a vanishingly small effect at these distances, and anyone who tells you a magnitude 7.7 on a back arc thrust has meaningfully loaded a megathrust segment 800 kilometres away is going considerably further than the evidence supports. The second reason is the honest one, and it has nothing to do with physics. Attention. The southern segment I'm about to describe has been sitting there, fully documented in peer-reviewed literature for years. The people who study it have published their maps, their models, their tsunami scenarios, and their numbers. None of that changed on Saturday. What changed on Saturday is that several million people suddenly started staring at a map of Indonesia, and some of them noticed the thing that was already there. That is a much less dramatic reason for making a video, and it is also the true one, so it is the one I am going with. Because here is what those people are looking at, and here is why the specialists who work on this margin have been trying to get anyone to pay attention to it for the better part of a decade. Run your eye west from Flores, past Sumbawa, past Lombok, past Bali, onto the southern coast of Java itself. I want to stop on that word Java for a second, because if you are not from the region, the name probably does not carry the weight it should. Java is an island roughly the size of England. It holds somewhere in the region of 150 million people. That makes it, by a very comfortable margin, the most populous island on the face of the earth. More people live on Java than live in Russia. More people live on Java than live in Japan. And a very large number of them live on or near the southern coast, which is to say the coast that faces the open Indian Ocean, with nothing between it and the trench. Now look offshore, out into that ocean, at the trough running parallel to the shoreline. In the entire era of instrumental seismology, that section of the Sunda megathrust has not produced a single large interplate thrust earthquake. Not one. And before anyone reaches for the obvious objection, no, that is not because nothing is happening down there. The Indo-Australian plate does not stop pushing when it reaches Java. Convergence across this margin runs at something in the region of 6 to 7 centimetres a year, which sounds trivial and is not. 6 centimetres a year is roughly the rate your fingernails grow, and it never pauses, and it has been going for millions of years. Over a single human lifetime, that is around 5 metres of relative plate motion. Over the roughly 120 years of instrumental seismology, it is on the order of 7 or 8 metres. That motion has to go somewhere. It either comes out as earthquakes, or it comes out as slow aseismic creep, or it accumulates as elastic strain in rock that is holding on and will eventually stop holding on. Those are the only 3 options. There is no fourth option where the plate motion simply does not happen. And along the southern flank of Java, in the entire time we have been able to measure, we have not seen it come out as large earthquakes. So which of the remaining 2 is it? That question is the whole ball game, and it is not rhetorical. 2 different answers to it produce 2 completely different futures for 150 million people, and 2004 did not fix it. Part 4. The segment that has never broken. On the 26th of December 2004, the Sunda megathrust failed off the northwestern tip of Sumatra. The rupture started at a point roughly 160 kilometers off the coast, and then it did something that almost nothing on this planet does. It kept going. It tore northward for something in the region of 1,300 kilometers, up past the Nicobar Islands, up past the Andamans, unzipping the plate boundary for around 8 to 10 minutes of continuous rupture. Magnitude 9.1 to 9.2, depending on whose moment tensor you prefer. The seafloor lifted, the ocean lifted with it, and roughly 230,000 people across 14 countries died, most of them without any warning at all, many of them in places that had no idea an earthquake had happened until the water arrived. That event is, for most people, the definitive Indonesian earthquake. It is the one everybody remembers, and the reason I'm bringing it up is not to retell it, because you have heard it, but to point at something about it that almost never gets mentioned. It went the wrong way. The rupture propagated north, northwest, then north, along the Andaman segment. It did not propagate south. It stopped at its southern end, roughly where it started, off Aceh. Everything below that point on the Sunda margin was left exactly as it was on Christmas Day. Now, the Sumatran section of the megathrust has been busy since. In March of 2005, the segment immediately south of the 2004 rupture failed in a magnitude 8.6 near the island of Nias. In September of 2007, the Bengkulu segment further south went in a magnitude 8.4. That is a boundary progressively unloading itself southward over a couple of decades, one enormous piece at a time, and it is one of the best documented sequences of its kind anywhere on Earth. And it stops at Sumatra. Follow the trench around the corner, past the Sunda Strait where Krakatoa sits, and onto the Java section, and the sequence simply does not continue. There is no 2009 event, no 2014 event, no equivalent great rupture on the Java segment at any point in the instrumental era. The scientific literature states it about as plainly as scientific literature ever states anything. The Java subduction zone lacks large interplate thrust events for the entire era of instrumental seismicity. Read that carefully, because every word in it is load-bearing. Large, interplate, thrust. Those three qualifiers mean a big earthquake on the actual plate interface, the contact between the descending slab and the overriding plate. Java has had earthquakes, plenty of them. It has had earthquakes inside the descending slab, at depth, which are a different animal entirely. It has had crustal earthquakes on faults within the island. What it has not had, in the entire window during which humans have had instruments capable of telling the difference, is the specific thing that produces a 9. Now I want to put an honest boundary around that claim, because the phrase entire era of instrumental seismicity sounds enormous and is not. Reliable, globally consistent earthquake magnitudes go back to roughly the beginning of the 20th century. Genuinely good ones, with the moment magnitude scale and dense global networks, go back to somewhere in the 1960s and 70s. So when we say a fault has not produced a great earthquake in the instrumental era, we are talking about a window of maybe 120 years, and a really high-quality window of maybe 60. Megathrust recurrence intervals are not measured in that unit. Cascadia, off the Pacific northwest coast of North America, goes roughly every 500 years, and it has gone 41 times in the last 10,000 years by the offshore turbidite record. Some segments of the Chilean margin go every 100 to 150 years. Some segments of the Japan Trench appear to go every 500 to 1,000. 120 years of watching a fault that might have a 500-year cycle tells you approximately as much about that fault as watching a person for 4 hours tells you about their sleep schedule. Which brings us to the thing that would actually resolve it, and the reason this margin remains genuinely uncertain. For Sumatra, there is a spectacular geological archive. Coral microatolls along the outer islands record the slow sinking and sudden uplift of the coastline over centuries, growing outward in rings that act as natural tide gauges, and researchers have used them to reconstruct a rupture history on the Sumatran segments, going back more than 700 years. For Cascadia, there are drowned forests, buried marsh soils, and a Japanese tsunami record that pins the last event to the evening of the 26th of January, 1700, with a precision that still seems slightly unreasonable. For the south coast of Java, that work is far thinner. Some of it exists, not nearly enough of it exists. The coastline geometry, the sediment supply, and the geology do not offer the same kinds of natural recorders, and the research effort simply has not been at the same scale. So for this particular segment, we're in an uncomfortable position. We have a short instrumental record showing nothing, and we do not have a long geological record telling us whether nothing is normal. Although there is one more archive available here that most subduction zones do not have, and it cuts in an interesting direction. Java has been densely populated and continuously documented for a very long time. There are written records for this island going back centuries, through the Dutch colonial administration, and before that through Javanese court chronicles. That is a written history far deeper than the instrumental one, and in principle a great earthquake, and a 15-metre wave on the south coast of Java is not the sort of thing that goes unrecorded by a literate society. Except the geography works against you in a very specific way. The centres of population, administration, and record-keeping on Java have overwhelmingly been on the north coast. Batavia, which is now Jakarta, faces north, into the Java Sea, on the sheltered side of the island. The great trading ports faced north. The colonial bureaucracy sat in the north. The south coast, the one that faces the open Indian Ocean and the trench, was for most of that history the back of the island. Less developed, less documented, and less likely to generate a written account that survived. So the historical silence on the south coast is softer evidence than it looks, because the recording apparatus was pointed the other way. And this region has a hard demonstrated history of water arriving, without warning, that has nothing to do with a megathrust at all. In 1883, Krakatoa, sitting in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, destroyed itself and generated tsunamis that killed something in the region of 36,000 people. In December of 2018, the flank of Anak Krakatau, the volcano that grew out of the 1883 caldera, collapsed into the sea and produced a tsunami that killed more than 400 people along the coasts of Java and Sumatra, with no earthquake, no seismic trigger, and therefore no warning of any kind. The warning system watches for earthquakes. That wave did not come from one, and here is the psychological trap that sits at the centre of this entire story, and honestly at the centre of most natural hazard failures throughout history. Absence reads as safety. The human brain is built to learn from experience, and it learns overwhelmingly from things that happened. A coastline where a great earthquake struck in living memory has evacuation routes, drills, sea walls, tsunami markers, and grandparents who tell the story. A coastline where nothing has ever happened, within anyone's memory or their parents' memory, has a beach, hotels, a fishing fleet, and a general sense that this is simply not the kind of place where that occurs. The hazard is identical. The preparedness is not even close. This is not a hypothetical concern about Java. It is a description of what happened on the 26th of December, 2004, all the way around the rim of the Indian Ocean. There was no Indian Ocean tsunami warning system in place that morning, because in living memory the Indian Ocean did not do that. The Pacific had one. The Indian Ocean had not needed one, right up until the moment it desperately needed one and did not have it. So a segment of plate boundary that has been quiet for the whole of the instrumental record is not reassuring. Depending on what that quiet actually means, it is either the least interesting thing on the map or the most. Two independent groups of measurements have taken a run at answering exactly that, and they arrived at the same place from completely different directions. Part 5. 2 methods, 1 answer. In September of 2020, a paper appeared in Scientific Reports with 11 authors across multiple institutions, led by the Indonesian seismologist Sri Widiantoro. The title tells you what it is about with unusual directness: implications for megathrust earthquakes and tsunamis from seismic gaps south of Java, Indonesia. That paper is the reason anyone is talking about the Java Trench tonight, and it is worth understanding what it actually did, because the method matters as much as the answer. They ran 2 completely separate lines of investigation, using 2 completely different kinds of data that had no reason at all to agree with each other. The first line was earthquake relocation. Indonesia's geophysical agency has been recording seismicity across the archipelago for decades, and there is a very large catalogue of events sitting in that archive. The problem with any raw earthquake catalogue is that the locations in it are only as good as the velocity model used to compute them. Seismic waves travel at different speeds through different rock, and if your model of the subsurface is even slightly wrong, every hypocenter you calculate is slightly wrong too, in ways that smear real structures into blurs. Relocation is the process of going back through that archive and recomputing all of it with better methods, using the relative timing between events recorded at the same stations to sharpen everything up. When you do it properly, structures that were invisible in the raw catalogue snap into focus. Fault planes that looked like clouds resolve into surfaces, and gaps that were hidden inside the noise become visible. That is what they found. Clear gaps in the seismicity along the megathrust south of Java, stretches of the plate interface where the small and moderate earthquakes that should be sprinkled along an active boundary are simply absent. Now, a gap in a seismicity map is an ambiguous object on its own. It could mean the interface there is locked, accumulating strain silently, producing nothing until it produces everything. It could also mean the interface there is not accumulating anything, and there is nothing to see because there is nothing happening. A seismicity gap by itself does not tell you which is why the second line of investigation is the important one. The second line was space geodesy. Indonesia has a network of permanent satellite positioning stations planted in the ground, and those stations report their own coordinates continuously with millimeter-level precision. If the ground under a station is moving, the station tells you, not in a general sense, specifically in millimeters per year, with a direction. Here is what makes that so powerful for this question. If the plate interface offshore is locked, then the overriding plate above it is being dragged along and squashed. The islands themselves get compressed and lifted, and every satellite station on them drifts in a direction, and at a rate that reflects how tightly the interface below is stuck. Feed enough of those measurements into an inversion, and you can produce a map of the offshore interface showing where it is fully locked, where it is partially locked, and where it is sliding freely. Seismologists call the result a slip deficit model, because what it is really mapping is the difference between how much the plates should have slid past each other and how much they actually have. It helps to have the actual physical picture in your head, because it is more intuitive than it sounds. Imagine pressing the edge of a heavy book against the edge of a table, and then pushing the book slowly forward. If the edge catches, the book bends, storing the push as elastic deformation, and every point on that book is displaced from where it would otherwise be. If the edge is greasy and slides freely, the book just moves, and nothing bends. The satellite stations on the islands are dots drawn on the book. Their motion over years tells you whether the edge is catching or sliding, and how tightly, and over which portions of the contact. For a locked megathrust, the signature is unmistakable. The coastline slowly contracts toward the trench, and, depending on where you are relative to the locked patch, either subsides or rises by a few millimeters a year. For a freely creeping interface, that signal is essentially absent. Run enough stations for enough years, and you can convert those millimeters into a map of the contact 50 kilometers beneath your feet, which is a genuinely remarkable thing to be able to do with a receiver bolted to a concrete pillar. The satellite work and the earthquake relocation work agree. The same segments south of Java that show up as seismic gaps in the relocated catalogue show up as regions of high slip deficit in the geodetic inversion. Two datasets with nothing in common, one made of ground shaking and one made of orbital ranging, one looking backward through decades of archived seismograms, and the other measuring the present in real time, pointing at the same stretches of seafloor. The paper's own language is measured, and I am going to keep it measured because it earns its authority by being careful. It says the relocation and the satellite inversion reveal clear seismic gaps to the south of Java, and that these gaps may be related to potential sources of future megathrust earthquakes in the region. May be related to potential sources. That is not a forecast. It is not a prediction. It is scientists saying, as precisely as they can, that they have found segments of a plate boundary that appear to be storing strain, and that if a great earthquake happens along this margin, this is where it would come from. That word agreement is the reason this matters more than any single alarming number. In earthquake science, almost everything is a single line of evidence with a large uncertainty attached. Two independent methods converging on the same conclusion is rare, and it is the closest thing this field has to a strong signal. And I want to be fair about the limits of both methods, because neither one is magic, and Indonesia has recently provided a very public demonstration of what happens when the models are incomplete. In September of 2018, an earthquake struck the island of Sulawesi, north of where we are looking tonight. It was a strike-slip event, not a megathrust rupture, which meant the ground moved sideways rather than up. Sideways motion is not supposed to generate a large tsunami. A large tsunami arrived anyway, into Palu Bay, and combined with catastrophic soil liquefaction, it killed over 4,000 people. The mechanism turned out to involve underwater landslides and the shape of the bay funneling the wave, and it was, for a lot of people who study this, a genuinely humbling event. The models were not wrong so much as they were not complete. So the honest framing on the Java work is this. It gives you a map of where the interface appears to be storing strain. It does not give you a date, it does not give you a magnitude, and it does not guarantee that the eventual rupture will look like the scenario anyone modelled. What it does is narrow the question from where should we be worried, along 4,000 kilometres of plate boundary, down to these specific segments, which is a genuinely large amount of information, and considerably more than most coastlines on Earth have. So let me connect this back to what is happening off Flores this week, because the connection is not what most of the coverage is implying. None of this is new. The paper came out in 2020. The satellite stations have been running continuously the entire time. The relocated catalogue did not change on Saturday morning. The slip deficit on the segments south of Java is, as far as anyone has published, exactly what it was a week ago and a year ago. An earthquake on the back arc thrust north of Flores did not add anything measurable to the load on a megathrust segment 800 kilometres to the southwest. What Saturday did was move the map. Millions of people who had never thought about Indonesian tectonics in their lives spent the weekend looking at one, and a fraction of them scrolled west and asked the obvious question about a suspiciously blank piece of coastline. That question already had an answer. It had been sitting in the literature for years. That is a less satisfying story than a warning shot, and I would rather give you the true one. But there is a second interpretation of a seismic gap, and it is not the one I have described. It is the one that says the entire framework is wrong, that a quiet segment is quiet because it has nothing to give, and that the whole exercise of pointing at blank spots on a map and calling them dangerous is a decades-old mistake that seismologists keep repeating. That objection is serious, it has real evidence behind it, and it deserves to be taken apart properly. Part 6. Locked, or simply loose. The idea that a quiet stretch of an otherwise active fault is a dangerous stretch has a name. It is called the seismic gap hypothesis, and it is one of the most intuitive ideas in all of Earth science. Faults accumulate strain at a steady rate. Strain has to be released. So a section that has not released any in a long time must be holding more than its neighbours, and it is therefore next. It is elegant, it is obvious, and its track record as a forecasting tool is genuinely poor. This is not a fringe complaint. In the early 1990s, seismologists tested the gap hypothesis formally by taking published gap forecasts and checking what actually happened afterwards. The result was not encouraging. In some of those tests, the gap-based forecasts performed no better than assuming earthquakes occur where earthquakes have recently occurred, and in some cases they performed worse than that. Large earthquakes turned out to be uncomfortably fond of striking places that had just had one, which is exactly the opposite of what the hypothesis predicts. So the plain version of the argument, the one that says nothing has happened here, therefore something must, is not a good argument, and I am not going to make it. Here is the alternative reading, and it is the one that actually threatens the entire Java story. A section of plate interface can be quiet because it is stuck and silently loading. It can also be quiet because it is not stuck at all. If the contact between the two plates is weak, if it is lubricated by water and soft sediment and clay, then the plates simply slide past one another continuously without ever accumulating enough elastic strain to produce a large earthquake. That process is called aseismic creep, and it is real, it is measurable, and where it dominates, a segment can absorb enormous amounts of plate motion while producing nothing bigger than a rattle. We have covered this exact behaviour on land. Earlier this month we looked at the central section of the San Andreas Fault, the stretch that creeps continuously rather than locking, and which for decades was considered the safest piece of that entire system for exactly this reason. Except, as we discussed then, it turned out not to be that simple. Work published in 2022 based on rock samples drilled directly into the fault zone found chemical biomarkers indicating that the creeping section has hosted well over 100 ruptures of magnitude 6.9 or larger. A fault that creeps most of the time is not a fault that cannot break. It is a fault that creeps most of the time. Hold that thought, because it applies directly to what comes next. There is also a third state, and it is the one that has done the most to change how this field thinks in the last 25 years. A plate interface does not have to be either stuck or sliding. It can do something in between, sliding in slow motion, releasing the equivalent of a large earthquake's worth of movement over days or weeks instead of seconds, quietly enough that nobody feels a thing and only the satellite stations notice. These are called slow slip events, and where they happen they are usually accompanied by a faint continuous seismic hum called tremor, which is why the phenomenon is often referred to as episodic tremor and slip. We looked at exactly this behaviour on the Cascadia margin earlier this month, where the tremor bursts migrate along the deep edge of the interface on a schedule regular enough that you can almost set a calendar by it. The important thing about slow slip is where it happens. It concentrates on the deep down-dip edge of the locked zone, beneath the coastline and inland, in the transition where the rock is getting hot enough to start behaving plastically. It does not typically occur on the shallow up-dip portion out near the trench, so a real subduction interface is layered. Down deep it flows. Somewhere in the middle it sticks, and that is where the great earthquakes nucleate. And up shallow, near the trench, in the youngest and wettest and softest material, it does something else again, and that something else is the least understood part of the entire system. So which is Java? Locked or loose? This is the point where the 2020 paper matters most, and it is also where I have to introduce the biggest weakness in the whole picture. The naive gap argument uses only absence. Nothing here, therefore danger here. The satellite work does something fundamentally different. It makes a positive measurement. It does not say we see no earthquakes. It says we observe the ground on Java moving in a way consistent with the interface offshore being stuck, and here is the map, and here is the deficit, and here are the numbers. That is a categorically stronger claim than an argument from silence, and it is why this case survives the criticism that sank the general hypothesis. Now, the weakness. Every one of those satellite stations is on land. The interface they are trying to image is offshore, and it slopes away from the coast, so the further out you go along the megathrust toward the trench, the further you are from your nearest measurement. Resolution degrades with that distance, and it degrades badly. A locking map derived from land-based stations is at its sharpest directly under the coastline, and at its blurriest, exactly where the shallow part of the interface meets the trench, and the shallow part of the interface, right up near the trench, is precisely the part that matters most for tsunamis. To put a number on how badly that hurts, the trench off southern Java sits somewhere in the region of 200 to 300 kilometers from the coastline, depending on where along the island you measure. So the shallowest and most tsunami-genic portion of the interface is a couple of 100 kilometers from your nearest instrument, and the signal you're trying to detect from that distance is a few millimeters a year of horizontal motion buried inside all the other things that move the ground. Inversions of that kind do not fail loudly. They produce a smooth, plausible-looking map with wide error bars that most people never see, and the smoothness is an artifact of the method rather than a property of the fault. There is a fix. It is called seafloor geodesy, and it involves putting transponders on the ocean floor above the fault and ranging to them from ships or autonomous vehicles. Japan has invested heavily in it off the Japan Trench and has produced results that genuinely changed how people think about that margin. It is expensive, it is slow, and almost nowhere else on Earth has it at the density required. The Java Trench does not have it. So the honest answer to locked or loose is partly locked, according to the best data anyone has, with the largest uncertainty sitting on the exact portion of the fault that would generate the wave. And there is one more ingredient here that is going to matter enormously in a few minutes, so let me put it on the table now. What gets fed into a subduction zone is not just rock. The oceanic plate entering the Java Trench arrives carrying a blanket of sediment on its back, accumulated over tens of millions of years of crossing an ocean basin. Some of that sediment gets scraped off at the trench and piled up into a wedge. Some of it gets dragged down along the interface, and the material that ends up smeared along that shallowest few kilometers of the plate contact is not granite. It is clay-rich, water-saturated, weak, and mechanically nothing like the rock deeper down. That material has a very particular personality. It is generally too weak to store the kind of elastic strain that produces a violent high-frequency rupture. When it fails in a mushy, drawn-out way. In the technical language, it is velocity strengthening rather than velocity weakening, which means it tends to resist accelerating once it starts to move. For a long time, the working assumption in this field was that the shallow up-dip portion of a subduction interface therefore could not host significant rupture at all, and was effectively a break. That assumption did not survive the last 2 decades. it turns out that a rupture which starts deeper in the strong locked zone can drive itself up into that weak shallow material and keep going. And what happens when it does is genuinely strange, because the rupture slows down dramatically while the amount of slip stays enormous. The fault moves a very long way, very slowly, very close to the seafloor. Hold every part of that sentence, because it is about to become the most important thing in this video, which is a deeply unsatisfying answer on locking, and I would leave it there, except for one thing. The locked or loose debate is a debate about whether this margin can produce a great earthquake, and on this particular margin, that debate has already been overtaken by events, because the Java Trench has demonstrated a way of killing people that does not require a great earthquake at all. It has done it twice in the last 30 years. Part 7. 20 metres. The 2020 paper did not stop at mapping the gaps. Having identified segments of the megathrust that appear to be storing strain, the authors did the obvious next thing, which is to ask what happens to the coastline if those segments let go. They ran tsunami models for several rupture scenarios along the South Java megathrust, and the numbers that came out are the ones that have been circulating in Indonesian media, sometimes accurately and sometimes not, ever since. The worst case they modelled is the one where both megathrust segments spanning Java rupture at the same time. In that scenario, the modelled tsunami reaches heights of approximately 20 metres on the south coast of West Java and approximately 12 metres on the south coast of East Java, with an average maximum height of about 4.5 metres along the entire southern coastline of the island. I am going to be extremely careful about how those numbers get used, because this is exactly the point in a video like this where accuracy usually dies. That 20-metre figure is the output of a physical model for a specific scenario, chosen deliberately as a worst case. It is not a forecast. It is not a prediction. It is not a statement that this is going to happen. Nobody in that author list said the words 20-metre tsunami is coming, and when Indonesian media ran with the number in 2020, the researchers themselves went out publicly to say precisely that, and to ask people to stop treating a modelling result as a warning. The purpose of running a worst-case scenario is not to tell the public what will occur. It is to tell civil defence planners what their evacuation infrastructure has to survive. With that firmly established, let us look at what those numbers actually describe, because they deserve to be understood properly rather than either hyped or waved away. 20 metres is about the height of a 6-storey building, and a tsunami of that height is not a wave in the sense that word usually means. It does not break over you and recede. What arrives is the sea itself, rising and continuing to rise, moving inland as a wall of water carrying whatever it has already picked up, which by the time it reaches the second street inland includes cars, boats, roofing, trees, and the walls of the first street. The destructive agent is rarely the water. It is the debris field the water is carrying at the speed of a sprinting person. And for calibration, because a number without a reference point is just a noise, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami produced run-up heights along parts of the Aceh coastline reaching around 30 metres. So a 20-metre scenario is not an absurd figure invented to frighten people. It is smaller than something this ocean did within living memory, on the same plate boundary, roughly 2,000 kilometres up the same trench. But I would argue the 20-metre number is not the most important one in that set. The 4.5-metre average is. 20 metres is a peak, and peaks in tsunami models are highly localised. They occur where the bathymetry funnels energy in a specific bay on a specific stretch of coast. 4.5 metres, averaged along the entire south coast of Java, is a description of the general case. It is what most of that coastline would get, and 4.5 metres of moving seawater is comfortably sufficient to destroy essentially everything in a single-storey Indonesian coastal village, of which there are a very large number along that shore. There is an analogy that helps here, and I use it because the distinction between a scenario and a forecast is the single most misunderstood idea in hazard science. When engineers design a bridge, they calculate what it must withstand under the worst load it could plausibly ever see. That calculation is not a prediction that 100 lorries will one day park on it simultaneously in a gale. It is a specification. Hazard modelling works the same way. The 20-metre figure is a design load for a coastline, and the correct response to a design load is not panic. It is building to it. So who lives there? The south coast of Java is not empty. Cilacap is a major port and industrial city with a population in the hundreds of thousands, sitting on a low coastal plain. Pangandaran is a resort town. Pelabuhan Ratu is a fishing port. Along the Yogyakarta coast, The beaches at Parangtritis and through Bantul Regency are among the most visited stretches of shoreline in the country, packed with day visitors on weekends. Behind almost all of it, the land is flat for several kilometres before it starts to climb. And it is not only people. Cilacap hosts one of the largest oil refineries in Indonesia, sitting on that same low ground, on that same coast, facing that same trench. Along the whole southern shore there are fishing fleets, cold storage, processing plants, and the small boat harbours that a very large number of households depend on for their entire income. A 4.5-metre inundation across that shoreline is not simply a body count. It is the removal of an economy in an afternoon from a stretch of coast several hundred kilometres long. That flatness is the operational problem. In a near-field tsunami, generated by a rupture just offshore, the time between the earthquake and the arrival of the water is on the order of 20 to 40 minutes. That is the entire window. There is no bulletin from another country, no hours of transit across an ocean basin, no time for a decision-making chain. 20 to 40 minutes on foot from wherever you happen to be standing. If there is high ground within that distance, the coastline is survivable. If there is not, the only answer is vertical evacuation, meaning purpose-built structures tall enough and strong enough to stand in the flow while people climb them. Japan has built thousands of those. Indonesia has built some. Not nearly enough for a coastline of that length. There is also a hard limit on what technology can do for you inside that window. Deep ocean pressure sensors, the kind that sit on the seafloor and detect a tsunami passing overhead, are the gold standard for confirming that a wave is real and estimating its size. They are also, in a near-field event, close to useless for the nearest coastline, because the wave reaches the shore at roughly the same time the sensor tells you about it. Indonesia has had a long-running and well-documented struggle keeping its offshore buoy network functioning at all, between funding, maintenance, and the simple fact that unattended equipment floating in busy water gets damaged and stolen. For a coastline 20 minutes from the source, the only warning system that reliably works is the one between your ears, and it only works if the ground shakes hard enough to trigger it. And Indonesia has been having this argument publicly for years. The word megathrust entered ordinary Indonesian conversation in a serious way when officials began talking openly about seismic gap scenarios, and the reaction split exactly the way these things always split. Some of the coverage was measured, some of it was pure panic, and a substantial amount of the public response was to ask whether the whole thing was a hoax, which is what happens every single time an institution communicates a probability to a public that was expecting a prediction. The scientists said this is a scenario we should plan for. A significant fraction of the audience heard this is going to happen soon, found that it did not happen soon, and concluded they had been lied to. That gap between what was said and what was heard is, in my view, a bigger threat to that coastline than any uncertainty in the slip deficit model. A population that has decided the warnings are exaggerated is a population that will not run. To their considerable credit, the researchers themselves went straight at this. When the 20-metre figure took off across Indonesian media, the lead author and the country's research minister both put out public statements whose message amounted to "please calm down, this is a modelling result. The correct response is preparedness rather than fear." That is a scientist doing exactly the right thing, and it is worth saying out loud, because the usual complaint about researchers is that they hype their own findings, and here you have the opposite happening in real time. The number still ran. It always does. Once a figure like 20 metres is loose in a headline, no amount of careful qualification pulls it back. But here is the thing that genuinely keeps me up about this margin, and it is not the 20-metre scenario, because the 20-metre scenario at least comes with an earthquake violent enough that nobody could possibly mistake it for anything else. This coastline has a different failure mode, one where the earthquake is enormous and the shaking is not. Part 8. The earthquake you cannot feel. In 1972, the seismologist Hiru Kanamori published a paper describing a category of earthquake that, on paper, should not exist. He called them tsunami earthquakes, and the definition is deceptively simple. A tsunami earthquake is one that generates a tsunami far larger than its shaking would lead you to expect. Note what that is not. It is not an earthquake that causes a tsunami, because plenty of them do that. It is an earthquake whose tsunami is out of proportion to how big it felt. The mismatch is the entire diagnosis. For a long time this looked like a paradox because the energy in the wave has to come from somewhere. If the seafloor lifted enough water to produce a 15-metre run-up, the fault moved a very long way, and a fault moving a very long way is an enormous earthquake. So how does an enormous earthquake feel small? The answer is that human beings and buildings and the seismic instruments people relied on for most of the 20th century are not sensitive to how much a fault moves. They are sensitive to how fast it moves. Here is the analogy I keep coming back to, and it works better than any technical explanation I have found. Take a heavy door, slam it. The door travels perhaps a meter, and it makes an enormous bang that you feel in the floor and in your chest. Now take the same door and push it closed slowly over 10 seconds. It travels exactly the same meter. It arrives in exactly the same place, and it makes essentially no sound at all. The displacement is identical. The noise is not even comparable. What generates the bang is not the distance travelled, it is the acceleration and the abruptness of the stop, and that translates almost directly into what seismologists call high-frequency energy. High-frequency energy is what shakes you. It is what rattles windows, cracks plaster, throws objects off shelves, and triggers the primitive part of your nervous system that tells you to get outside right now. It is also what most magnitude scales were historically built around, because those scales were designed to measure the sort of shaking that damages things. Long-period energy is different. It is slow, rolling ground motion with wavelengths measured in kilometers. Tall buildings sway in it. People often barely register it, and when they do, they typically describe it as feeling dizzy or seasick rather than as an earthquake. But long-period motion is exactly what moves the ocean, because the ocean is enormous and responds to being lifted over a wide area, not to being rattled quickly. So now assemble the two halves. You have a rupture propagating up into that weak, wet, clay-rich material near the trench, the stuff we talked about earlier. Because that material is soft, the rupture front slows down dramatically. Because the rupture is now happening in the shallowest part of the interface, directly beneath thin water and close to the seafloor, the displacement it produces is transmitted almost entirely into vertical movement of the seabed. And because that shallow material is weak, it can accommodate an enormous amount of slip. The result is a fault that moves a very long way, very slowly, in exactly the place where moving the seafloor lifts the maximum amount of water, while generating almost none of the high-frequency energy that would tell anybody standing on the beach that something catastrophic had just happened underneath them. It is, in the most literal possible sense, an earthquake you cannot feel. And there is a second consequence that made these events genuinely dangerous for decades, which is what they do to the magnitude estimate. The scales that were used operationally for most of the 20th century, particularly surface wave magnitude, systematically underestimate slow ruptures. They saturate. So a tsunami earthquake would come in on the boards as, say, a 7.0, when the actual moment released was equivalent to a 7.8. The instruments were making the same mistake the people on the beach were making for exactly the same reason. Everybody, human and machine, was measuring the bang rather than the movement. That is now largely fixed, and the fix is worth understanding because it is genuinely clever. Modern warning centers compute what is called the W-phase solution, which uses very long period waves arriving early in the record, precisely the part of the signal that a slow rupture is rich in and that the old scales ignored. They also compute the ratio between the high-frequency energy an event radiated and the total moment it released. If an earthquake released an enormous amount of moment while radiating very little high-frequency energy, that ratio is anomalously low, and that low ratio is the machine-readable signature of a tsunami earthquake. An analyst can now see, within minutes, that an event is slow and can escalate the tsunami response accordingly, even though the shaking reports coming in say the earthquake was mild. So the instruments have been upgraded. Moment magnitude, computed from the actual seismic moment rather than from the amplitude of a particular wave, does not saturate the way the old surface wave scale did, and the diagnosis is now routine. And I want to be clear about what that fix does and does not buy you, because this is the crux of the whole problem. It buys you a correct classification, quickly, in an operations center. It does not buy you the thing you actually need, which is a person on a beach deciding to walk uphill. The chain still has to run from the operations center, through a national warning agency, through whatever dissemination system exists, to a siren or a phone or a person with a loudhailer, to a crowd on the sand who are being asked to abandon an afternoon on the strength of an announcement about an earthquake they did not feel. Every link in that chain has to work in about 20 minutes, at whatever hour of the day or night it happens to be. But it is worth understanding that the fix is recent, and it applies to the warning centres and the agencies. It does not apply to the person standing in the surf, whose detection system has not been upgraded since the Pleistocene. Now, everything I have just described is general physics that could apply to a number of subduction margins, and it is worth knowing that this is not some obscure theoretical category with two examples. It has a long and appalling history. The event that gave the field its clearest early warning was in June of 1896, off the Sanriku coast of northeast Japan. The shaking on shore was so mild that people at a festival that evening reportedly carried on with it. Somewhere between 20 and 35 minutes later, a wave estimated in places at well over 20 metres came ashore, into towns full of people who had no idea anything had happened. The death toll is usually given at around 22,000. That single event is, in many respects, why Japan takes this class of earthquake as seriously as it does. The modern type example came in September of 1992 off the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. Magnitude 7.7, almost identical to Pangandaran. Coastal residents described the shaking as weak, and many did not notice it. Run-up reached around 10 metres, and roughly 170 people died. That event is the one that put the term tsunami earthquake firmly into operational use, rather than leaving it as a curiosity in the literature, and there is one that happened on this exact plate boundary which almost nobody outside the field talks about. In October of 2010, a magnitude 7.8 struck the shallow portion of the Sunda megathrust off the Mentawai Islands west of Sumatra. Same margin, same failure mode. The shaking was long and gentle rather than violent. The wave that followed reached the Mentawai Islands within minutes and killed something in the region of 400 to 500 people. So the running total on this one plate boundary is 3: 1994 off East Java, 2006 off West Java, 2010 off the Mentawais, 3 tsunami earthquakes in 16 years on the Sunda margin, all in the shallow up-dip zone, all producing waves out of proportion to their shaking. That is not a fluke. That is a habit. Tsunami earthquakes have also occurred off Peru, in the Kuril Islands, and elsewhere in Japan. But there is a reason I have spent this long on the mechanism, and it is this. The Java Trench is not a place where a tsunami earthquake is theoretically possible. It is a place where they have actually happened, in living memory, twice, 32 months of coastline apart, and both times they did exactly what the physics says they should do. The second of those two is the one I want to walk you through in detail, because the reconstruction is well documented, and it is genuinely difficult to sit with. Part 9. Pangandaran, the 17th of July. Pangandaran is a beach town on the south coast of West Java. It sits on a narrow isthmus with water on both sides, connecting the mainland to a forested headland, which makes it geographically lovely and, from a tsunami perspective, essentially indefensible. It is a domestic holiday destination. On any given afternoon there are families on the sand, food stalls behind the beach, fishing boats pulled up on the shore, and hotels one street back from the water. On the 17th of July 2006, just after 3 in the afternoon local time, the plate interface offshore let go. Magnitude 7.7. That is not a marginal earthquake. A 7.7 is, in raw energy terms, a major event, in the same class as the one that struck off Flores on Saturday morning. If a 7.7 of the ordinary kind had happened at that distance offshore, everybody on that beach would have known about it instantly. Buildings would have shaken hard. People would have run. That is not what happened. The accounts from that afternoon are remarkably consistent, and they are the reason this event matters more than any statistic in this video. Many people on the coast did not feel the earthquake at all. Others felt something they described as a gentle swaying, a mild dizziness, the sort of sensation you dismiss and forget about within 10 seconds. Nobody left the beach. Nobody moved inland. There was no reason to. From the perspective of a human being standing on that sand, nothing of any consequence had occurred. Roughly 45 minutes later the water came. Run-up heights along that coastline reached up to 15 metres in places. 730 people died. Many thousands more were injured, and tens of thousands lost their homes along a stretch of coast several hundred kilometres long. It struck a coastline that had received, in effect, no warning at all, because the natural warning, the one every coastal population on Earth ultimately depends on, had failed to fire. 45 minutes is worth sitting with, because in tsunami terms it is a generous amount of time. That is not the 20-minute nightmare scenario. 45 minutes is enough time to walk 2 or 3 kilometers inland at a fast pace. It is enough time to get an entire beach clear if anyone had known to start walking. The thing that killed those 730 people was not the transit time of the wave. It was the fact that the clock never started, and the isthmus geometry made it worse in a way that is almost cruel. Pangandaran sits on a narrow neck of land with sea on both sides. In a normal coastal town, inland is a direction. On an isthmus, for a large part of the built-up area, there is no inland within reach. There is only the far shore, which is also the sea, or the wooded high ground of the headland, which is in the opposite direction from the mainland and therefore counterintuitive to run toward. When the water came, it came across a strip of land narrow enough that in places it went straight over. There is a detail from that afternoon that I think about more than any other. Fishermen who were out on the water offshore over deep ocean reported noticing nothing at all. That is entirely correct physics. In deep water, a tsunami is a long, low swell, sometimes only tens of centimeters high, spread over a wavelength of 100 kilometers or more. A boat rides straight over it without the crew registering anything. The wave only becomes a wall when it reaches shallow water, and the front of it slows down while the back of it keeps coming, stacking all that energy vertically. So there were men sitting on calm water a few kilometers out who felt nothing from the earthquake, saw nothing from the wave, and came back in to find their town gone. I want to be precise about the institutional side of this too, because it is often reported carelessly. Warning bulletins were issued. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center recognized the event and put out messages within the standard window. The problem was not detection. The problem was the last few kilometers, the part of the chain that runs from a bulletin in an operations center to a person on a beach who needs to be told to move within the next half hour. In 2006, that link, on that coastline, did not functionally exist. There were no sirens on that shore. There was no mechanism by which a message reaching Jakarta became a message reaching Pangandaran. And even if the message had arrived, consider what it would have been asking people to do. It would have been asking them to abandon a beach on a pleasant afternoon on which nothing had happened, on the strength of an announcement, with no physical sensation of any kind to corroborate it. That is a very hard thing to ask of a crowd. In a normal tsunami scenario, the earthquake does that work for you. Violent shaking is enormously persuasive. Here there was nothing to persuade anyone of anything. Compare that with 2004 in Aceh, which is instructive precisely because the outcome was so much worse in absolute terms, and yet the mechanism of failure was completely different. In Aceh, the shaking was extreme and prolonged, in some accounts 8 to 10 minutes of it. People knew a colossal earthquake had occurred. What they did not know was what an earthquake of that kind does to the sea, because there was no cultural memory of it and no education program, and so a great many people went down to the shore to look at the strange retreating water. That is a knowledge failure. It is terrible, and it is fixable with public education. An enormous effort has gone into fixing it in the 2 decades since, and the damage was not confined to one town. The wave came ashore along a stretch of the South Java coast, running for several hundred kilometers, hitting a string of fishing villages and beach settlements, most of them built on flat ground within a few hundred meters of the waterline, most of them single-story, most of them constructed from materials that a moving wall of water treats as suggestions. In the days afterward, the pattern along that coast was the one you see in every near-field tsunami. A clean strip where everything was removed entirely, then a chaotic band inland where the debris was deposited, then, very abruptly, a line where the water stopped and the buildings are untouched. People a few hundred meters apart had completely different mornings. Pangandaran is a different and much harder problem. That is not a knowledge failure. You can teach every person on that beach exactly what to do when they feel strong shaking. You can run drills every year, you can put up signs, and it will not help them because they will not feel strong shaking. The instruction you have taught them will never be triggered. That is the thing about this margin that I find genuinely difficult, and it is why I wanted to build this whole video around it rather than around aftershock counts. Every standard piece of tsunami preparedness advice in the world contains, somewhere near the top, the words, "If you feel strong shaking near the coast, move inland or to high ground immediately." It is excellent advice. It has saved a very large number of lives, and on the south coast of Java, it has already failed twice, for reasons entirely outside the control of the people it failed. To be fair about what has changed since, quite a lot has. Indonesia built a national tsunami early warning system in the years after 2004, and it became operational in 2008, which is to say 2 years too late for Pangandaran. It has seismic stations, tide gauges, modelling capability and a dissemination network, and it is a genuinely serious piece of national infrastructure. It has also, in the years since, been tested repeatedly by real events and found to have real gaps, particularly around near-field sources and particularly around the last mile of getting a message to a specific stretch of shoreline. The system exists. Whether the system solves the specific problem this margin poses is a different question, and I do not think anybody would claim it is fully solved. Because 2006 was not the first time. Part 10, 185 seconds. Here is what the seismograms say actually happened under Pangandaran that afternoon, and the numbers are worth going through slowly, because they are the physical fingerprint of everything I have just described. The rupture ran for approximately 200 kilometers along the plate interface. It propagated at a speed of roughly 1 to 1.5 kilometers per second, and the whole thing lasted about 185 seconds, just over 3 minutes. Let me put that rupture velocity in context, because on its own the number means nothing. In a typical large earthquake, the rupture front travels along the fault at somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 kilometers per second. That is not arbitrary. It is close to the speed at which shear waves travel through crustal rock, which is around 3.5 to 4 kilometers per second, and there are good physical reasons why a rupture front tends to run at a substantial fraction of that. 1 to 1.5 kilometers per second is roughly a third to a half of normal. This rupture was crawling, and 3 minutes is an extraordinarily long time for a fault to be moving. A typical magnitude 7 earthquake is finished in something like 15 to 20 seconds. Even the 2004 Sumatra event, which tore for 1,300 kilometers, was over in 8 to 10 minutes, and that is an event more than 1,000 times larger in energy. So imagine standing on that beach. For 3 continuous minutes, a 200-kilometer section of the Earth's crust was tearing open beneath the water in front of you, lifting the seafloor as it went, and it made almost no sound at all, in the seismic sense, because it was moving too slowly to make one. That is the door being pushed closed instead of slammed at the scale of a mountain range. The 185 seconds is doing something else too, and this is the part that gets missed. A slow rupture is not just quiet, it is also efficient at moving water. The sea has a response time. A very fast seafloor motion can partly outrun the ocean's ability to respond to it. A slow, sustained lift over 3 minutes gives the water column plenty of time to be displaced in full. The physics that makes the event undetectable to you is the same physics that makes the wave larger. Those are not two separate problems. They are the same property of the rupture, viewed from 2 directions. For contrast, ruptures can also go the other way. A small number of earthquakes have been documented running faster than the shear wave speed of the surrounding rock, which is called supershear rupture, and those produce an intense concentrated shock front and unusually violent shaking. So the range of possible rupture velocities spans something like a factor of 4 from one end to the other, from crawling ruptures like Pangandaran up to supershear events, and where a given earthquake lands on that scale is determined largely by what material it is tearing through. Strong, dry, competent rock at depth gives you fast. Weak, wet, clay, rich sediment near the seafloor gives you slow. It is the same fault. It is not the same rock. And 2006 was the second one, not the first. On the 2nd of June, 1994, essentially the same thing happened 400 kilometers to the east, off the coast of East Java, magnitude 7.8, weak shaking on shore, run up heights that reached 13 meters, more than 200 people killed, most of them asleep because it struck in the middle of the night, and the first indication anybody had that an earthquake had occurred was the water coming through the wall. 2 events, 12 years apart, on adjacent sections of the same margin, both classified as tsunami earthquakes, both producing waves radically out of proportion to their felt shaking. There is one more number in the 2006 event that is worth holding against everything we discussed earlier, and it is the rupture length. 200 kilometers. Set that against the scale of the segments the slip deficit work is describing. The gaps identified south of Java are not 200-kilometer features. They span the length of the island, which is over 1,000 kilometers of coastline, and the modelled worst case involves 2 of those segments going together. So the 2 events this margin has actually produced in living memory, the ones that killed 930 people between them, were ruptures on a fraction of the interface that the mapping says is loaded. I am not trying to be dramatic with that comparison, and it does not follow that a longer rupture is due. A fault does not have to break everything that is loaded, and most of the time it does not. But if you want a sense of the range this margin operates over, 1994 and 2006 are the small end of it, not the large end, and they were both quite bad enough. At which point the obvious question is whether the slow rupture behaviour is a coincidence, and the answer, according to work published on the structure of this margin, appears to be no. A study in the journal Solid Earth in 2021 examined the marine forearc structure of eastern Java, specifically to understand the 1994 event, using seismic imaging to look at the architecture of the wedge of material sitting between the trench and the coast. The finding, in essence, was that the slow rupture behaviour is tied to the geometry and the material properties of that forearc. It is not a random misfire. It is a consequence of how this particular margin is built, of the thickness and character of the sediment, of the shape of the wedge, of what is sitting on that shallow portion of the plate contact, which means it is a property of the place, and properties of places do not go away. That is a genuinely important distinction, and I want to make sure it lands because it changes what kind of statement this whole video is making. If the 1994 and 2006 events had been flukes, two unlucky ruptures that happened to catch soft ground, then you could reasonably say the odds of a third are low and get on with your day. But if the slow rupture behaviour is a consequence of how the sediment and the wedge are arranged along this margin, then it is not a matter of luck at all. It is a description of what this fault does when it moves in that zone. And that arrangement of sediment and wedge is still there tonight. It will still be there in 100 years. Nothing in the last 30 years has changed it, and nothing that happened off Flores on Saturday changed it either. There is also a version of this that is worse than either of the two events I have described, and I am going to state it plainly rather than dress it up. Both 1994 and 2006 were magnitude 7.7 to 7.8 events on limited sections of the margin. The slip deficit work is not talking about that. It is talking about segments that, if they went together, would be very substantially larger. A slow, shallow, quiet rupture across a much longer stretch of that interface is the scenario in which the 20-metre figure and the tsunami earthquake mechanism stop being two separate topics in a video and become one event. Nobody has said that is going to happen. I am not saying it is going to happen. What I am saying is that when you ask what the credible bad day looks like on this specific margin, that is what the published evidence points at, and it is a fundamentally different shape of problem from a coastline that simply needs better seawalls. So let me now put the two halves of this video together, because they finally meet here. We have a segment of the Sunda megathrust along the south coast of Java that two independent methods identify as storing strain, with the greatest uncertainty sitting on the shallow portion nearest the trench, and we have a documented, twice demonstrated tendency for exactly that shallow portion of exactly this margin to fail in slow, quiet ruptures that produce waves nobody sees coming. Those two statements are not in tension. They are the same statement approached from opposite ends. The weak shallow material that makes the locking map blurry is the weak shallow material that makes the ruptures slow, and that, rather than any count of aftershocks off Flores, is the actual reason this stretch of coastline deserves your attention. Which brings us back to the noise, because there is a great deal of it this week, and a considerable amount of that noise is being offered as evidence for things it cannot possibly support. Part 11. The volcanoes. Everyone is counting. There is a list going around this week, and you have probably seen a version of it. It goes something like this. Semeru is erupting in East Java. Lewatobi Laki Laki is erupting on Flores. Etna is in the middle of its biggest eruption in decades and has closed Sicily's busiest airport. Kilauea has just produced another episode of high lava fountaining in Hawaii. Shivlush is throwing ash 12 kilometers into the sky over Kamchatka. Campi Flegrei, under Naples, recorded its strongest instrumental earthquake ever a couple of weeks ago. A magnitude 7.7 has struck Indonesia. A magnitude 6.9 has struck Indonesia, and a fireball exploded over the Pacific Northwest. Laid out like that, in a single list, it looks overwhelming. It looks like a planet doing something. So let me take that list apart, because every single item on it is true, and the conclusion drawn from it is not. First, the actual numbers, because they are genuinely impressive on their own terms, and deserve to be stated properly rather than used as set dressing. Semeru erupted on the 5th of August and produced 23 separate eruptions in 1 week. By the 12th, monitors were logging 100 explosions in a single day, with plumes reaching 1,100 meters above the vent. It sits at alert level 3, with all activity prohibited within 13 kilometers of the summit, down the southeast flank along the Besuk Kobokan Valley, and pyroclastic and lahar hazards extending as far as 17 kilometers from the peak. Lewitobi Laki Laki, on Flores, has been producing grey ash columns between 200 and 1,200 meters nearly every day since the end of July, also at alert level 3, with a 5-kilometer exclusion radius, and volcanic ash advisories running continuously through the middle of this month. Etna began a new eruption on the 6th of August. By the 13th it had entered its 7th day, and European coverage has been describing it as behaviour not seen from the mountain since the 1970s. Ash has reached 24,000 feet. Catania Airport, the busiest in Sicily, suspended arrivals and closed. Across 1 week, more than a third of 1,974 scheduled flights were cancelled and around 600 more were diverted. A new vent opened in the Valle del Bove. Kilauea's episode 53 began at 3:45 in the afternoon Hawaii time on the 12th of August. It ran for 9.5 hours of continuous fountaining from the north vent before ending abruptly at 23 minutes past 1 in the morning. Fountains reached around 500 feet. Roughly 6 million cubic yards of lava came out, covering something like 40 to 50% of the floor of the Halemaumau crater. Šivelich has been producing near daily explosions through July and into August, with ash columns reaching 12 kilometers, keeping North Pacific aviation on alert. Every one of those is real. Everyone is remarkable in its own right. And now watch what happens when you put them on a timeline instead of in a list. Semeru's current eruptive phase started on the 5th of August. That is 10 days before the Flores earthquake. Lewitobi Laki Laki was already erupting through the end of July and the first week of August. 2 to 3 weeks before the Flores earthquake, Etna's eruption began on the 6th of August. 9 days before the Flores earthquake, Kilauea's episode 53 started on the 12th of August. 3 days before the Flores earthquake, Šivelich has been going near daily since July. Weeks before the Flores earthquake, the Campi Flegrei quake was on the 31st of July. 15 days before the Flores earthquake. Every single volcanic item on that list predates the earthquake it is supposedly connected to. That is not a subtle statistical point. That is not me quibbling about confidence intervals. That is a straightforward matter of which thing happened first, and in every case the answer is that the volcanoes did. You cannot be caused by something that has not happened yet. Whatever the Flores earthquake did or did not do, it did not start any of those eruptions, because all of them were already running when it occurred. Now, the second problem with the list, which is subtler and honestly more interesting. At any given moment, somewhere between 40 and 50 volcanoes on this planet are in a state of continuing eruption. Not restless, not showing unrest, actually erupting. That is the normal condition of the Earth. It has been the normal condition of the Earth for as long as anyone has been counting, and it will be the normal condition next month and next year. So on any random Tuesday you choose, you can generate that list. You can always generate that list. Pick a date at random from the last 30 years, spend 20 minutes with the volcanic activity reports for that week, and you will find 4 or 5 significant eruptions in progress across 4 or 5 continents. Add in the roughly 15 magnitude 7 or greater earthquakes the planet produces annually, plus a bright fireball, plus whatever weather is doing something unusual somewhere, and you have a list identical in structure to the one circulating this week. The difference between an ordinary week and an extraordinary week is not usually the number of events. It is the number of people compiling them, and there is a structural reason these lists proliferate now in a way they did not 20 years ago, which has nothing to do with geology at all. Every one of those events is individually documented in near real time, in public, with video. Ash plumes get satellite imagery within the hour. Lava fountains get live streams. Earthquakes get automated alerts on your phone. A fireball over a populated area now produces 200 eyewitness reports and 30 dashcam videos before breakfast. None of that existed at this density even a decade ago, and none of it means the Earth got busier. It means the Earth got observed. If you built the same list for a week in 1985, you would have had 2 newspaper paragraphs and a grainy photograph, and the identical set of events would have felt like nothing at all. If you want to check this for yourself, and I would encourage you to, the Smithsonian Institution publishes a weekly volcanic activity report. It is free, it is public, it comes out every Wednesday, and it lists every volcano in the world that did something notable that week. Go and read 3 or 4 of them from months when nothing seemed to be happening. The lists are the same length. The difference is that nobody screenshotted them. I should also say a word about Campi Flegrei, which sits on the end of most versions of this list. We covered that record earthquake in detail when it happened at the end of July, so I'm not going to relitigate it here. But it belongs in this section for the same reason as everything else. It occurred more than 2 weeks before the Flores rupture, in Italy, on an entirely different plate, in a volcanic system driven by processes that have been escalating steadily since 2020 and have nothing whatsoever to do with Indonesia. And I do want to be fair here, because I do not think the people making these lists are being dishonest. The instinct behind it is a good instinct. Noticing that several things are happening at once and asking whether they are related is exactly what you should do. It is the foundation of how connections get found. The failure is not in asking the question. The failure is in not checking the base rate and in not checking the order of events, both of which take about half an hour and dissolve most of the apparent pattern. But I'm not going to leave it there, because there is a version of the earthquake and volcano connection that is real, that is published, and that produced a genuinely spectacular demonstration almost exactly a year ago. Part 12. 600 Years of Silence. On the 29th of July 2025, a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck off the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East. It was the largest earthquake anywhere on Earth since Japan in 2011. In the days that followed, Klyuchevskoy erupted. Klyuchevskoy is the most active volcano on the peninsula, so on its own that is not headline material. And then, on the 3rd of August, Krasheninnikov erupted, ash to around 6,000 metres. Krasheninnikov had not erupted in approximately 600 years. That is the case for the earthquake and volcano connection, and it is a strong one. Not because a volcano erupted near a big earthquake, but because a volcano that had been silent through the entire European Renaissance woke up within 5 days of the largest earthquake on the planet in over a decade, a few hundred kilometres away. Coincidence is always possible, but a 600-year gap closing inside a 5-day window next to a magnitude 8.8 is the kind of coincidence that a reasonable person is entitled to find suspicious. And the physics behind it is not hand-waving. There are at least 3 well-described mechanisms by which a large earthquake can perturb a volcanic system. The first is static stress change. A large rupture permanently deforms the crust around it, squeezing some regions and stretching others. If a magma reservoir sits in a region that gets squeezed, the pressure inside it goes up. If it sits in a region that gets stretched, the cracks and dikes feeding it can be pulled open, a process called unclamping, which makes it easier for magma to move upward. Either effect can push a system that was already close to erupting over the line. The second is dynamic stress, and this one is more elegant. As seismic waves pass through a magma body, they compress and decompress it repeatedly over seconds. In a magma that is close to saturated with dissolved gas, that shaking can trigger the formation of bubbles, and bubbles are what drive eruptions. This is sometimes described as the champagne effect, which is a decent shorthand for the physics of shaking a pressurized fluid until it starts to foam. The third is simple mechanical disturbance. Sloshing in the reservoir, collapse of crystal mush, disruption of a plug that was holding a conduit closed, and there are historical cases that are hard to explain any other way. In November of 1707, an enormous earthquake ruptured the Nankai Trough off southern Japan, an event now estimated at around magnitude 8.6. 49 days later, Mount Fuji erupted. That eruption, the Hoi eruption, remains the last time Fuji has erupted at all, and it dropped ash on the city that is now Tokyo. 49 days is a long gap, and a purist would say you cannot prove the connection. But Fuji had been quiet for centuries before it, and has been quiet for over 300 years since, and the one time it went was 7 weeks after the largest earthquake in that region's recorded history. Closer to the present, in November of 1975, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck the south flank of Kilauea in Hawaii, and an eruption began at the summit within about an hour. Same volcano, same structure, immediate response. That is about as tight a coupling as you can observe, and crucially this has been tested statistically rather than just argued. Published work going back to the late 1990s found a detectable increase in the rate of volcanic eruptions in the days following large earthquakes for volcanoes within a few hundred kilometers of the rupture. Read that distance figure again, because it is the whole point. A few hundred kilometers. In the published work, the effect is found within roughly 750 kilometers. It is not global. It is a regional effect. It falls off sharply with distance, and it is generally strongest for volcanoes that were already primed and would probably have erupted within months anyway. The earthquake does not create an eruption from nothing. At most, it pulls forward one that was already loaded. So apply that honestly to this week. The distance from the Flores rupture to Lewatobi-Laki-Laki is small. Same island. That is well inside the range where a coupling effect is physically plausible, and it is worth watching closely over the coming weeks to see whether Lewatobi's behaviour changes, whether its explosion rate or plume heights shift, whether anything else along the Banda arc begins showing new unrest. If any of that happens, that is a real observation, and I will cover it. The distance from the Flores rupture to Etna is roughly 12,000 kilometres. The distance to Kilauea is around 9,000. The distance to Shiveluch is around 8,000. Those are not near misses on the 750-kilometre threshold. They are more than 10 times outside it, in a relationship that falls off steeply with distance, for events that had all already started before the earthquake happened. There is no mechanism, no correlation, and no chronology supporting any of it. It also matters that the effect works best on systems that were already loaded. Krasheninnikov, for all its 600 years of silence, sits in one of the most magmatically productive regions on the planet, next to Klyuchevskoy, which erupts more or less constantly. The magma was there. The plumbing was there. What the earthquake plausibly did was open a path, or add the last increment of pressure, to a system that had spent 6 centuries getting ready. That is a very different claim from saying an earthquake conjured an eruption out of nothing, and it is the only version the evidence supports. And there is a timescale problem that cuts both ways in these arguments. If a volcano erupts within hours of a large earthquake, as Kilauea did in 1975, the connection is easy to accept. If it erupts within days, as Krasheninnikov did, it is still compelling. Once you get out to weeks or months, as with Fuji in 1707, the case gets much harder to make statistically, because the number of volcanoes that erupt within a few months of any given large earthquake, purely by chance, is not small. So the honest window for this effect is short. Hours to days, close in. Anything claiming a connection across weeks and thousands of kilometres is stacking 2 weak inferences on top of each other and calling the result strong. Which is a slightly frustrating place to land, because the Krasheninnikov story is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves better than being used as a license to connect everything to everything. The real finding is narrower and, to my mind, more interesting. Big earthquakes can nudge nearby volcanoes that were already close to going. That is a real and rather beautiful piece of physics about how tightly coupled this planet's systems are at short range. It is also, unfortunately, completely useless for explaining a list of volcanoes on 5 separate tectonic plates, which brings me to the rest of that list. Part 13. The Opposite Side of the World. Let me clear the remaining items quickly, because none of them survive contact with a calendar or a calculator, and I would rather spend the time on the things that do. Start with the second Indonesian earthquake, because it is the one being used most creatively. 13 hours after Flores, on the same day, a magnitude 6.9 struck North Sumatra, about 15 kilometres north-northwest of Pematang Siantar, and about 50 kilometres north of Parapat, which sits on the shore of Lake Toba, 2,800 kilometres from the first event. No casualties, no significant damage, no tsunami. Roughly 11.6 million people felt moderate shaking, and it was noticed as far away as Malaysia, and essentially no aftershocks. 1 magnitude 2.7 the following morning, and that is it. Both of those facts, the absence of damage and the absence of aftershocks, come from the same number. That earthquake was 183 kilometres deep. It happened inside the descending slab far below the crust, in rock hot enough to behave more like putty than like glass. Deep events do not produce rich aftershock sequences because the surrounding material does not sustain the brittle stress concentrations that generate them, and they do not produce heavy damage because their energy has to travel through 183 kilometres of rock before it reaches anybody. The reason it is being talked about at all is the map position. Lake Toba is the caldera of an eruption around 74,000 years ago that ranks among the largest in the entire Quaternary record, and there is a long-standing and much-repeated hypothesis that it caused a genetic bottleneck that nearly ended our species. That hypothesis is contested and has been substantially weakened by later work, and I would encourage you to hold it loosely. But on the specific question of whether this earthquake means anything for Toba, look at the depths. The magma plumbing of even a very large silicic system sits at something like 5 to 20 kilometers. This earthquake was at 183. It is an order of magnitude too deep to be part of that system in any meaningful way. The dot on the map is genuinely near Toba. The earthquake is nowhere near it in the direction that matters, which is down. Next, the antipode claim, which is currently circulating with real force. The idea is that a large earthquake produces a corresponding large earthquake at the antipode, the point diametrically opposite on the globe, and the specific prediction being pushed after the Sumatra event is a major earthquake somewhere around Ecuador. Here is the thing that makes this worth engaging with rather than dismissing. The underlying physics is not fake. Seismic waves genuinely do focus at the antipode. A wave leaving an earthquake in every direction travels around and through the planet and reconverges on the far side, and that focusing is real and measurable. People have detected it. The problem is the amount of energy that survives the trip. After passing through 12,742 kilometers of the Earth, including the core, that focused energy is orders of magnitude below what would be needed to break a fault that was not already about to break. And then there is the verification method, which is where the whole thing falls over. The forecasts in circulation use search radii of 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers around the antipodal point. Draw a 3,000 kilometer circle anywhere on the Pacific Rim, and you have enclosed a substantial fraction of the most seismically productive crust on the planet. Over any reasonable window, that circle will contain a significant earthquake by chance alone, every single time. A prediction that cannot fail is not a prediction. It is a horoscope with coordinates. Then there is the solar cycle argument, which says that as we descend from solar maximum toward minimum, global volcanism statistically increases, driven by changes in ionospheric charging and induced electrical currents in the crust. There is real published literature attempting this, and I do not want to be dismissive of people working on it. But the effect sizes reported are small, the datasets are short compared with the cycles being tested. The eruption catalogues have well-known completeness biases that vary over exactly the timescales in question. Replication has been poor, and there is no quantified physical pathway by which currents induced in the crust produce forcing at the scale required to move magma. It is an open question. It is not an established driver, and it should not be used as one. The magnetic pole argument is similar. The pole motion figures being quoted are broadly correct, and they are genuinely striking. The North Magnetic Pole crawled at under a kilometre a year through the 19th century, accelerated through the 20th, hit something close to 58 kilometres a year around 2010, and is running at roughly 40 kilometres a year now. The South Atlantic anomaly really has developed a second lobe. The Canadian flux lobe really is weakening while the Siberian one strengthens. All of that is accurate observational geomagnetism, and it is fascinating. What is missing is any demonstrated pathway from the geometry of the external field to the generation of magma hundreds of kilometres down. The field is produced by motions in the outer core, which means the correlation, where it is claimed, runs backwards from the proposed causation. Interesting data. Unsupported conclusion. The fireball briefly. On the 14th of August, a bolide crossed over Washington State and British Columbia, bright enough to be reported by hundreds of people, and it was picked up on seismographs right across the Cascadia region. That last detail is the one being used, with the framing that the volcanoes of the Cascades felt it. They did not feel anything. The seismographs recorded an atmospheric pressure wave, which is a thing seismographs do very well, and which tells you nothing about the ground. The object is estimated at around 16 inches across, weighing roughly 170 pounds, releasing around 10 tons of energy at about 28 miles altitude. 10 tons is a rounding error against the stresses inside a volcano. It was a beautiful event, and it is geologically inert. And Hurricane Lala, which made a direct hit on the Big Island of Hawaii as a Category 1, reported as the first likely direct hurricane strike there in something like 155 years, with rainfall forecasts up to 25 inches, at least one death, and 100 or more homes destroyed or damaged on the southern part of the island. That is a genuinely rare and genuinely serious event, and it happened in the same week as Kilauea's episode 53, which is exactly the kind of coincidence that makes a list feel like a pattern. It is a rare tropical cyclone track. It is not a geological signal. One last thing, and it is a small point with a large implication. Several people this week noticed that third-party earthquake visualization tools were showing gaps in coverage, with regions that clearly had activity on the agency's own catalogue simply not rendering on the map. That is almost certainly a feed or rendering problem under extreme event volume rather than anything sinister. But it is a useful reminder, in a week when the entire public argument is being conducted by counting dots on a screen, that the screen is a rendering of a feed, and the feed is not the ground. Part 14. What would actually change? The answer. So where does all of this leave us? The Java Trench did not become dangerous this week. That is the honest summary, and I want to make sure it does not sound like a letdown, because it is not one. The segment of the Sunda megathrust running along the south coast of Java has been exactly as dangerous as it is tonight for the entire time human beings have been building towns on that coast. The relocated seismicity showed those gaps before Saturday. The satellite stations were measuring that slip deficit before Saturday. The 2006 event killed 730 people 20 years ago, and the mechanism that did it has not changed since. What changed on Saturday is the number of people looking, and I keep coming back to the fact that this is the most dangerous property the whole system has, not the slip deficit, not the sediment, attention. A hazard that never produces an event does not generate the political will to build vertical evacuation towers, does not get drills scheduled, does not stay in the public mind, and does not compete for a budget line against the 100 things that are hurting people this year. Silence is not just how the fault behaves, it is how the fault gets ignored. So let me finish with the part that actually matters, which is what you should watch and what would genuinely move the needle either way, because I would much rather leave you with things you can check than with a feeling. The first thing is the one closest to hand. Does the Flores sequence produce a magnitude 6? The agency expects elevated activity for 1 to 2 months, with stabilization in 2 to 3 weeks. If a magnitude 6.0 to 6.5 turns up in the next few weeks, the entire missing sixes argument goes away, and this becomes an ordinary aftershock sequence that was slightly slow off the mark. That is checkable on any public earthquake catalogue, by you, any day you like. The second is whether that western cluster is real. Those small events between the Flores rupture and the rest of the archipelago are currently nothing more than dots on a plot. If somebody relocates them properly, checks them against a background rate, and finds that activity really is migrating along the arc, that would be the first hard evidence that anything is moving. If nobody does that work, or the work comes back showing normal background scatter, then it was never anything. The third is volcanic, and it is local. Does anything along the Banda arc change behaviour in the coming weeks? Liwatobi is close enough to the rupture that a coupling effect is physically plausible, unlike anything else on that list. A shift in its explosion rate or plume height, or new unrest at a neighbour that was quiet before Saturday, would be a genuine observation rather than a coincidence. And the fourth is the one that would matter most and is the least likely to arrive quickly. Does any agency publish an updated assessment of the South Java segments, a revised slip deficit model, a new relocation study covering the interface west of Flores, a statement from the people who actually run the network? That is where a real change in the picture would come from, and it would arrive as a bulletin, not as a seismogram, and it would probably arrive quietly. There is a fifth, and it operates on a completely different timescale, but it is the one that would actually settle this argument rather than nudging it. 2 kinds of work would resolve the Java question, in a way that no amount of watching aftershock counts ever will. The first is seafloor geodesy, putting instruments on the ocean floor above the shallow part of that interface, so the locking map stops being blurry in exactly the place it needs to be sharp. The second is paleotsunami and paleoseismology, going along the south coast of Java and digging, looking for the sand sheets that a great tsunami leaves buried in coastal marshes and lagoons, dating them, and building a rupture history that reaches back 1,000 years instead of 100. That second one is, in my opinion, the single highest value piece of unfinished business on this margin. Cascadia was transformed from an unknown quantity into one of the best characterized subduction zones in the world by exactly that kind of work, by people with shovels and radiocarbon dates and a Japanese tsunami record from the year 1700. Nobody has done that at the same scale for the south coast of Java. Until somebody does, the honest position on the Java Trench will remain that it has been quiet for 120 years, and we do not know whether 120 years is a long time there or the blink of an eye. None of those things exist tonight. That is worth saying plainly, because a lot of what is circulating this week is presented as though they do. And I want to say something about why I think that matters beyond this particular fault, because the pattern is not unique to Indonesia. Every hazard in the world competes for attention against every other hazard, and attention is allocated almost entirely by recency. After a disaster, funding flows, codes tighten, drills happen, and for a few years the coastline is as prepared as it will ever be. Then a decade passes with nothing, and the drills get shorter, and the evacuation signs fade, and the new hotel gets built a little closer to the water because the land is cheaper there and nobody can remember why. The hazard has not changed by a single decimal place. The preparedness has quietly reverted. The south coast of Java is that problem in its most extreme form, because there has never been a great earthquake there to start the clock. There is no decade of heightened readiness decaying. There is just a coastline that has always been fine, and a body of scientific literature that says it may not always be, and the enormous gap between those two facts that nobody has ever had a compelling reason to close. Here is what I keep sitting with. We have built an extraordinary apparatus for watching this planet. Satellites measuring the ground to the millimetre. Seismic networks that can locate a magnitude 1.3 under the sea. Models that can tell you the height of a wave that has not happened yet on a beach that has not been hit. And the thing all of that apparatus is pointing at, along the south coast of Java, is a stretch of seafloor whose defining characteristic is that it has never, in the entire time we have been able to look, done anything at all. We have gotten very good at measuring silence. We have not gotten any better at knowing what it means. So the question I am leaving on the table tonight is the small, checkable one, because it is the only one that will have an answer soon. 1,600 earthquakes have come out of that fault since Saturday morning, and exactly one of them was a 6. Somewhere in the next few weeks, either another one arrives, or it does not. And I genuinely do not know which of those two outcomes I would rather see.